Hello and welcome to my presentation. I'll be talking about an experiment I did as a submission for js13kgames that had something to do with genetic algorithms and neural networks. First, a word about myself. I'm in STX since forever, and if I was a character in Skyrim, this is how my skill tree would look like. I would have maxed out all the skills in JavaScript and Python, and now I'm investing all the spare points in machine learning. This is my main area of interest nowadays. So what are we going to talk about today? First, I'm going to tell you about the js13kgames competition, what it is and what are the rules. I'll tell you about the idea I had for the submission I wanted to do. I'll tell you what are neural networks, what are genetic algorithms. I'll tell you how those two can be put to work together. And I'll tell you what was the end result and maybe if there are any alternative approaches to this problem. So first of all, js13kgames is a competition where you are supposed to write a game in HTML5 and JavaScript. And the only rule is that you cannot refer to any external assets, and your code and assets, everything needs to be in a zip file that is less than 13 kilobytes long. Pretty simple. You should check out the games that are posted each year. They are pretty amazing. And I had an idea to do a submission as well. Let me show you my idea. So the game was about flying a little drone through a randomly generated maze. Each time you start the game, there will be a slightly different maze, and the game would feature inertia, it would feature gravity, and you could steer the ship left, right, and up. You couldn't steer it down, it just had to fall down on its own. And the idea was to traverse this randomly generated maze as fast as possible. So that was the idea for the game. But I told you that I'm into machine learning, so that's definitely outside my interests. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to have the player race against a bot, an artificial intelligence that would be self-steering the vehicle through the maze. And since I did a similar thing for an earlier conference this year, where I was solving this problem in a different way, I figured out I will try to do it this time differently, something that is not very commonly done. I wanted to use neural networks for steering the vehicle, but I wanted to use genetic algorithms for training this vehicle. So, I need to tell you a bit about neural networks and genetic algorithms first. What are neural networks? They are artificial structures that are modeled after biological cells in our brains. They are very highly flexible. What does it mean? Neural networks are often called universal function approximators. It means that a neural network of enough complexity can approximate any function you can think of. So they have a wide range of applications. Nowadays, they are all the rage. All the breakthroughs in artificial intelligence are based on neural networks. All this stuff that happens when the computers are playing in games against humans, Go, now they are playing also this League of Legends type of games, and they are starting to win, or they are playing StarCraft, whatever. This is all happening because of deep neural networks. And some people also think that if we develop them far enough, one day they're going to just get smarter than us and will kill us all. What are neural networks, though? Well, simply they are a function. They get some inputs that are passed through the neural network, and some output is produced. As simple as that. What are those inputs and outputs? Well, simply put, you put in floating point numbers, and you get out floating point numbers. One or many. As simple as that. Floating point numbers get in, floating point numbers get out. Okay. So how can we solve problems using this kind of a function? Well, let's talk about an example. Let's talk about gender prediction. Imagine that we have this idea that we want to use two variables, how tall a person is and how much they weigh, and we want to predict based on that if they are a man or a woman. First, let's verify if this is even possible. I extracted a subset of a medical data set, and on this chart you see the red dots are all women and the blue dots are men. If you look at this chart and think about how could we kind of split this so that we would be able to classify men and women based on this, Well, you will probably figure out that if you do some kind of a line at 165 of height and you say that everybody below 165 is a woman and everybody above 165 is a man, you would have a decent approximator, right? It won't be perfect, of course. There are women that are tall, there are men that are short, but generally this would work in statistically in most of the cases. So this problem is, can be seen as a binary classification problem. We get those two inputs, the height of a person and the weight of a person, and we pass this through the neural network that generates a single output. And this output is a probability of being a woman. So if it's a probability, it needs to be within the range of 0 to 1. And we assume that 0 to 0.5 is a man, and above 0.5 is a woman. How can we design a network that will predict this? Well, the network that I designed here is very simple and I would say classic. It has a hidden layer with two neurons that have ReLU activation. If you are into neural networks, you probably know what it is. It has one output neuron that is activated with a sigmoid function. What happens is first you put in the weight and the height of a person, then you need to scale it down to have it in some kind of standard range. What does it mean? It means that we are calculating the mean or average and standard deviation of the data, and we are scaling the data so that the mean would be at 0 and standard deviation would be at 1. Thanks to this, the network doesn't have to learn the scaling. It can just focus on learning the correlation between data. So this is the layer that will do the scaling. These are the scaled values. What happens in the neural network is a very simple math. Like, you cannot get it simpler. Neural network, each neuron is just a weighted sum of the inputs. So a weight times the value of the input plus weight times the value of the input. And this is for all the neurons in all the layers. This sigmoid thing here at the end is very important, because when we are doing these calculations, when we are doing the weighted sums, we don't actually know what's going to come out of this, right? So, but we need to have a probability as the output. So we need to be in range of 0 to 1. Thanks to mathematics, we have tools for that. There's, for example, this sigmoid function, which is the formula you can see here. And it maps all the possible inputs into a range of 0 to 1. Very handy. So if you want to output probability from your network, you just use a sigmoid activation function at the end, and you are guaranteed to output probabilities from the network. Perfect. So now the only problem is we need to train this network, and then we can check how actually it does predict. So I did this experiment. I trained it offline, and here I'm plotting how does the network work. And you can see that the white stuff at the top is what it classifies as a man, and all the darker bits are classified as a woman. The darker it gets, the more sure the network is that a given person is a woman. So you can see that it really did somehow find quite a nice way of separating men from women. And you can see that it did it even smarter than I assumed it would. I thought that it would just draw a line here and everything above it is going to be men, but actually, if you look closely enough, there are like two lines here. Thanks to this, the network can correctly predict also, for example, those slim but rather tall women, and also women that are a bit heavier and not that, and rather tall for women as well. So it managed to extract from the data some correlations, did it smarter than I would have done. Perfect. This is how neural networks can solve problems. Now, on to genetic algorithms. What are they? Genetic algorithms are just like neural networks, inspired by biology. You might have heard about this guy called Charles Darwin, and he had this idea about the process called natural selection. This is exactly what genetic algorithms are using. Genetic algorithms are described as a meta-heuristic. Heuristic is a process that finds solutions that are not guaranteed to be optimal, but usually they are good enough for use. There are problems that are very hard to solve, and they can take exponential time to find the perfect solution to, but usually there is a heuristic approach that can find you an answer that is suboptimal, but usually good enough in short time. And meta-heuristic because they can be applied to a broad range of problems. Now, what are the steps of a genetic algorithm? Turns out it's not actually that complicated. There are just 4 steps. First, you create an initial population of solutions. Then you assess fitness of each of those solutions. Afterwards, you select the solutions that are the most fit. Then you recombine and mutate them, and on to step number 2. You assess the recombined solutions are creating a new population, and you assess fitness of the new population. You do selection from those, recombination, and so on, generation after generation, hopefully getting a better and better solution each step you take. Now, let's look at those steps more in depth. Creating initial population. Well, the simplest way to do it is just to generate random solutions. You just generate lots of random solutions, and you are hoping that one of them will be somehow better than the others. So, what do you do next? You need to gather all the solutions that you created, and you need to assess the fitness of them. What happens is that you just kind of raise them for survival, and some of them perform better, some of them perform worse. The terms better and worse depend on the problem you are solving, of course. In the next step, you are selecting the best ones, so the ones that, for example, raised the furthest, or they were just the best. So, for example, I select those 3. And those 3 lucky solutions get to do sexual reproduction, otherwise known as recombination and mutation. But before we talk about sex, let's talk about genome. We humans are also kind of working with this genetic algorithms, and each human can be seen by the DNA that describes us. And the DNA is encoded by 4 bases. They have very nice Latin names. But if you think about this, each human could be encoded as a sequence of those 4 symbols. Each one of us would be slightly different. We would have some common parts, but generally you could encode each human as a very, very long sequence of those 4 characters. And the same process can be applied to genetic algorithms and to solutions. So in genetic algorithms, the only requirement is that you can encode a solution as a sequence of items. As simple as that. Fine. Let's go into sexual reproduction. Recombination. This is a process that also mimics nature. So we have a mother solution and a father solution. And those 2 are chosen from the population that survived, that had the best fitness. So the alpha males, for example, are being randomly chosen. 2 of those, and one becomes the father, the other one becomes the mother. And what happens is that we are first choosing a split point of the genome at random. Let's say we'll split it here. We make the same split in both genomes. Then we tear them apart, and then we are recombining. So what are we doing is we are taking the head from the mother and the tail from the father. We are combining them and thus getting a first child solution. With the rest, we apply the same process. We take the head from the father, the tail from the mother, and we have created 2 child solutions that are a recombination of the parent solutions. After we have done that, we can proceed to the mutation step. This is another thing that is modeled after nature. When the DNA is being copied, when the organisms are being created, there are sometimes errors introduced in transcription. And this is what this process mimics. Basically, we need to choose a subset of genes to modify, and we can just choose them at random, because why not? We just choose a fraction of genes to be modified. I select those two. What do I do next? I modify them. I create, and thus I have created a child solution that has a genome that doesn't correspond to any mother or father solution. As simple as that. Now, you know about the genetic algorithms, you know about neural networks, so let's see how they can be put together to work for a common goal. First, let me describe what I wanted to do in my game. Remember, I wanted to have a self-steering vehicle, so a bot that would control the little spaceship. And I wanted to use a neural network for steering it. I couldn't pre-train this network because the weights of such a network would not fit in the 13K limit for the competition. So what I had to do is I had to work live, and I figured out I will try to train this network live while the player was training, because I just couldn't pre-train it. There was not enough space for it. So I figured out, first, I will gather the pilot data, I will let the player race through a level on his own. I will gather all the data that I can while he's racing. Then I will try to do supervised learning, so I will try to teach a neural network to fly like the pilot did, so mimicking the pilot's behavior. And then in the next step, I will try to do unsupervised learning from the network from the previous step that will try to exceed the human performance. So the network would be training itself, trying to get better and better, hopefully surpassing the human levels. So, first step, gathering the pilot data. How does a person perceive the game? Well, we have our two sensors, right? We are looking at the pixels of the game. We are kind of perceiving what is happening, and then we are producing an action. And an action is a particular combination of keys on the keyboard that we are pressing. So we are perceiving the state of the game, and we are producing an action. But to replicate this for machine learning, it's possible. There are, of course, image recognition methods, but they are very computationally intensive. Like, you need weeks to train a network to recognize images fine. So that was out of the question. So I settled for a simpler thing, and I figured I will equip this little spaceship with sensors. If you have a car that is roughly newer, you probably recognize this to be similar to the parking sensors on the car. You have few arrays of sensors. In this example, I have them all about, not only in the front or in the back, but all around the vehicle, and they are detecting collisions with the nearby objects. So thanks to each sensor, the spaceship can tell how far is an obstacle on this given ray. And there are 20 of those sensor arrays, and they have 15 levels of sensitivities. There are 15 dots here, so the spaceship can see an obstacle that is this far. If it's further than that, it just doesn't see it, just like in a car. Also, the spaceship knows what is the horizontal velocity, so the speed with which it travels from left to right. It also knows the vertical velocity, so it knows if it's falling down or if it's ascending up. And it also knows vertical position, how far it is from the bottom of the level. So those are the data that the spaceship can have, the algorithm can use. And to make it aware of the time constraints, if you look at the obstacles that I have, they are actually quite sneaky. They require you, if you get to this point, under this, the hood of this mushroom, what you need to do is you need to go backwards and try again. So this requires you to actually know what you were doing earlier. And to make this happen, I'm giving the algorithm 6 frames of data, each 1 second apart. So basically, the spaceship knows what was happening with it 6 seconds ago. And 5 seconds ago, 4 seconds ago, 3 seconds ago, you get the drift. So we are gathering the pilot data by reading the sensors, recording the action that the human took, and we are storing this for use in training. And then we proceed to supervised learning. So we are trying to teach the algorithm to pilot the ship like the human did. So we have the sensors, we have the actions, and we are trying to teach the neural network to behave like the human. This is a classification problem. The network takes the inputs from the sensors, they are passed through the neural network, and it needs to produce an action that best fits the given state. What I wanted to do is go a bit against the mainstream. Usually this kind of training is done using dedicated neural network training algorithms like stochastic gradient descent or all the derivatives of it, which depend on backpropagation. And I thought, I don't want to implement backpropagation here because that's just too mainstream. I wanted to use something different. So I wanted to use a genetic algorithm instead of the backpropagation, which is a bit atypical. Let's remind ourselves how the genetic algorithm works. You select the initial population, you assess the fitness of all the solutions within the population, you select the best ones, you recombine, mutate them, and on to step number 2. Now, we need to talk about the genome. Previously, I was telling you that a genome needs to be, the solution needs to be encodable as a string of items. So how can we encode a neural network? Well, if we know the structure of the neural network up front, if we know that we're going to have one hidden layer with 2 neurons and 1 neuron in the output layer, the only thing that differs between many networks that we can create for this task are the weights. Nothing else changes. Everything else is just inputs as they are passing through the network. The activation functions, then they don't hold any state, so it's just the weights. So if you can just concatenate all the weights from all the layers into one long sequence, that can be the genome of your solution of your neural network. And this is what I did. So to create the initial population of solutions, I just create lots of neural networks with random weights. Then, assessing fitness. I would like to remind you that I'm trying to teach the network to behave like the human pilot. So how can I do that? Well, I know what the human was doing, right? I have the stored actions he took to given sensor inputs. So I'm trying to, for each network in the population to predict what the network would do for all the gathered sensor inputs. So I'm trying to make it respond to the same sensors the pilot was, to the same states that the pilot was going through. Then I'm comparing those with the predictions with what the pilot did. And I'm calculating accuracy of the predictions, trying to see how well is the network aligned with the pilot. And then, of course, I am choosing the networks that have the highest accuracy, so the ones that are predicting just like the human. Then I'm doing recombination and mutation, and those are exactly like I said earlier, no changes here. And hopefully what I'm getting is a neural network that replicates the pilot's behavior. So it behaves it takes the same actions in the same states that the pilot did. And this will be hopefully the copy of the pilot. Now, I proceed to the next stage, unsupervised learning, when I'm trying to go beyond the pilot's level. So what I'm doing now is I'm starting once again a genetic algorithm, a different one. This time, the population is not generated totally at random, but it's seeded with the neural network created in the previous step. So the network that resembled the pilot actions the best is used as the first solution in the population. And the rest of them I generate randomly, because why not? Now I need to assess fitness, and now my target is not to behave like the pilot. Now I want the networks to be as good as possible in traversing the level. So what I'm doing is I'm just racing them all on the same level. So I generate the random level, and I make all the networks race on it at the same time. And they are racing until one of them reaches the end of the level, or until time limit is exceeded. For example, if all of them get stuck at some earlier point in the level, no point in waiting, right? So I'm just racing them all, seeing which one will get, how far will they get. and I'm measuring the horizontal progress. So how far from the beginning of the level they get, because I want to select the ones that got the furthest to the end, possibly to the very end of the level. And if they are racing against each other, they are racing also against the clock. So if one of them gets to the end of the level, it means that all the other ones are probably not at the end of the level yet. So if I'm choosing the ones that are the furthest to the right, I'm choosing the ones that are flying the fastest. Then recombination and mutation goes just like previously described. And what I'm getting out of this is hopefully a network that flies better than a human pilot, because it was training on its own for many, many generations, improving on its own. It should get there. It should become better than humans. Results. Let me show you how it went. This is now I will fly with the pre-trained version of the artificial intelligence. I'm the guy at the bottom, and the network is the one controlling the one up. You can see that it's not doing very well. I have here kind of a fail-safe implemented, where if the network gets stuck for too long, it's getting pulled backwards, and then it can try again, go through an obstacle. So it does something. It flies a bit, sometimes even quite fast. It can get through some of the obstacles, but also it gets stuck a lot, and it doesn't progress that well. It's definitely not on par with human pilots, sadly. All the games in the competition went through a review stage where people were voting for the best game, and my game was 136th place. You can read some of the reviews that I got. Basically, people found the idea interesting, but the artificial intelligence was disappointing. They were mostly complaining that it took a lot of time and it didn't bring much value. So what were the problems with this approach? Well, the training was super slow. It was taking upwards of 1 hour to train the network to be at some kind of a level. The supervised learning accuracy, so when I was trying to teach it to behave like a human pilot, it was reaching up to 30%. And I couldn't let it train for longer because it would just prolong the whole process even more. And the agent was performing very poorly. You could see that it was just getting stuck and stuck and stuck. It learned something, but definitely not on a level that we would want it to. What were the possible reasons for this behavior? Well, the implementation was in pure JavaScript. The idea of the competition is to have stuff in as small a package as possible. So I was not using TensorFlow.js, for example. I was writing all of the stuff on my own in pure JavaScript. So the computations in pure JavaScript, generally JavaScript is not the correct language if you want to do computations, right? Just like Python. If you want to do fast computations in Python, use NumPy or use TensorFlow. You don't execute the calculations in Python code or in JavaScript code. Also, I wanted to do the online training. If I was doing pre-training, if I was teaching this network on my own, I could probably get it to be better, but each time it was learning on the data from the pilot, which could vary, and everything had to happen kind of fast because otherwise the players would get just totally bored. Also, this meant that the population size in the genetic algorithm had to be constrained, and the sizes of the neural network also had to be constrained, because otherwise the calculations would just take too long. A big thing I think that contributed to this not performing that well is genetic algorithms are kind of unguided training. What happens is that you are kind of doing random iterations, and you are hoping that they're going to bring you closer to your goal. When you are training the neural networks using backpropagation, the network error is being kind of backpropagated through the network, and the weights are adjusted accordingly to the weights that contributed to the error. So in neural networks, in genetic algorithms, is like guessing and hoping for the best. Also, I used very simple methods for setting initial weights of the network, and the weight mutation was also the simplest possible, just generate a random number and add it to an existing weight. So this experiment didn't go that well, but there are alternative approaches to this problem, to those problems. I told you that you can use TensorFlow.js, and if you use this kind of standard Adam optimizer, you get 90% accuracy on the supervised learning in minutes. And reinforcement learning is a method that I would suggest to use for this kind of problems. It was used with success for this kind of problems. I did a talk at STX Summit. You can find it on YouTube, where I was showing a solution to this problem using reinforcement learning, where there was a deep queue network approach used, and it was successful. The bots were winning with players 42 times out of 42 times. So they were generally better than humans, and you had to really, try hard to beat them. So I learned my lesson, but I'm happy that I tried this. I tried the genetic algorithm approach, and yeah, that was pretty fun, even if the place I took was not the best. You can find the dataset I used for the gender prediction. At this link, you can find the game at js13kgames, and you can find the source code of it on GitHub if you would like. Thank you. Are there any questions?